Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's CGR on behalf of the Department of Pediatric Gastroenterology on the topic chronic diarrhea in children, perplexing but rewarding to treat. Baseline pattern for the particular individual. Persistent diarrhea is also defined as more than 2 weeks of diarrhea, but it is acute in onset and usually seen in younger children. Mechanism of diarrhea is not alone related to small bowel and large bowel pathology causing malabsorption, but also can be due to liver dysfunction in the form of cholestasis or pancreatic insufficiency causing maldigestion. The mechanism of diarrhea might be due to a defect in digestion of nutrients or absorption of nutrients, altered gut transit, or increased GI secretions, or combination of more than one factor. Chronic diarrhea is classified as either inflammatory, fatty, and watery. Fatty diarrhea could be due to small bowel pathology causing malabsorption or small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, liver or pancreatic disorders causing maldigestion. Watery diarrhea can be secretory, osmotic, or due to rapid intestinal transit. The etiology of diarrhea is variable from congenital diarrhea in infancy to acquired causes in older children. Even the congenital diarrhea presenting in early infancy have varied etiology like defect in nutrient transport, defect in epithelial structure or brush border enzymes, defect in enteric endocrine functions or gut immunity. Hence, the chronic diarrhea is a widely varied spectrum of disorders in children across different age groups. Given are the list of various causes of chronic diarrhea across different age groups of children. The causes highlighted in red are disorders pertaining to smaller children. Etiology of chronic diarrhea also varies between developing and developed country. Even within the country, the etiology varies among different geographical location. Hence, it is important to know whether the common causes of diarrhea pertaining to the region where the patient comes from. The study conducted from our department
The person you
looking
are
at
speaking
various
with.
etiologies of chronic diarrhea in younger children showed celiac disease, cow's milk protein allergy, toddler's diarrhea contributes to almost 90% of the causes of chronic diarrhea presenting to our center. In the subsequent slides, we will be discussing a few interesting cases of chronic diarrhea evaluated from our department that was different from the usual causes. I would like to call Dr. Argya, our DM resident, to discuss the first case.
Thank you, and a very good morning to all. I am presenting the first case of a 4.5-year-old boy who presented to us with the history of passage of large volume, foul-smelling greasy stools since the 4 month of age. There was no associated history of blood or mucus in the stools. There was also history of failure to thrive. The birth weight of the child was 2.5 kilo, while he was 3.5 kg at the age of 9 months. And when he arrived to us at 4.5 year of age, he was only 10 kilo of weight. There was no associated history of jaundice, pruritus, or GI bleed. There was no history of recurrent chest or other side infection, oral ulcer, or ear discharge. There was no history of edema, blood transfusion, or any symptoms suggestive of fat-soluble vitamin deficiency like tetany, fractures, night blindness, or skin bleeds. The child is second by birth or born out of a non-consanguineous marriage. On examination, his weight and height centiles were well below third centile, as we can see in the growth charts. On general examination, there were signs of fat-soluble vitamin deficiency in the form of rachitic rosary and wrist widening. His systemic examination was normal. The tone, power, and dicturnal reflexes were normal. There was no ataxia, tremors, or nystagmus. Now we have a child who has presented to us with history of steatorrhea, failure to thrive, and rickets and onset in early infancy. In such clinical scenarios, we first think of the possibility of pancreatic insufficiency, and the most common cause in children is cystic fibrosis. If we find associated features of jaundice, pruritus, then we think of cholestatic liver diseases like bile acid synthetic disease or progressive familial intrahepatic cholestasis. Lastly, we consider the possibility of less common causes like congenital disorders of fat malabsorption, habital lipoproteinemia, hypobital lipoproteinemia, and chylomicron retention disease. So we proceeded to do the investigations. Peripheral blood smear source acanthocytes, which comprise of around 50 to 60% of all the RBCs. The liver function test did not reveal any features of cholestatic liver disease. The stool examination confirmed our diagnosis of steatorrhea. Ophthalmological evaluation did not show any retinitis pigmentosa. The ultrasound abdomen ruled out the possibility of pancreatic agenesis and also did not show any signs of chronic liver diseases. So now with the findings of apital lipoproteinemia and normal ultrasound and steatorrhea, we wanted to look at the lipid profile of the child, which was grossly abnormal. The triglyceride and total cholesterol was very low. The LDL and VLDL was undetectable. The lipid profile of the parents were normal. So, with the positive findings of apital acanthocytes and this abnormal LFT, we are now considering more the possibility of congenital disorders of fat malabsorption. So, we went ahead to do the further investigations. The upper GI endoscopy revealed an unusually white duodenal mucosa, and the histology from the duodenal mucosal biopsy revealed vacuolated enterocytes, as we can see in the images. On the positive findings of acanthocytes, abnormal lipid profile, whiteout duodenal mucosa, and vacuolated enterocytes in the duodenal biopsy, we made a diagnosis of A-beta lipoproteinemia, though the genetic confirmation of the disease could not be done due to financial constraints. Before I go into details of the pathogenesis of this disease and its treatment part, I would like to talk briefly about the normal digestion and absorption process of fat in our gut. So the pancreatic lipase, it helps in the lipolysis of the dietary fat, and then the bile acids secreted from the liver, they help in the micelle formation and this entry into the enterocytes. Within the enterocytes, this triglyceride and cholesterol esters, they gets incorporated into the apolipoprotein B within the endoplasmic reticulum, and then further it gets reprocessed in the Golgi apparatus into chylomicron, which then enter the lymphatics. This microsomal triglyceride transfer protein gene, the protein product of this gene, is usually helps in this delivery of triglyceride and cholesterol esters in the apolipoprotein. Mutation in these causes lipid malabsorption and deficiency of fat-soluble vitamins, thus leading to the clinical manifestations of steatorrhea, failure to thrive, hepatomegaly, ataxia, retinopathy, and neuropathy. Now we started the child on MCT oil-based low-fat diet, and along with that, there is supplementation of high dose of fat-soluble vitamins A, vitamin A, D, E, and K. The child is under our regular follow-up. His steatorrhea improved over 6 to 8 months after starting the treatment. His growth parameters improved significantly, as we can see in the growth charts. And in 4-year follow-up visit, he did not have any signs of visual or neurological complications like ataxia, retinitis pigmentosa, night blindness, etc. So, how do we evaluate a child who presents to us with steatorrhea? Firstly, we can get a fetal elastase test done, and if it is low or absent, then we should evaluate for the possibility of pancreatic insufficiency. If it is normal and there is evidence of chronic cholestatic liver disease, including abnormal LFT, then we should consider the possibility of bile acid synthetic defect and progressive familial intrahepatic cholestasis. Gamma glutyl transpeptide serum bile acid level and genetic testing will help in diagnosis those conditions. If both of these are normal, then possibility of congenital disorder of fat malabsorption should be thought of. And lipid, as we have seen in our child, the lipid profile of the patient, parents, peripheral blood smear, upper GI endoscopy, and diagnosis will help in clinching the diagnosis. And how do we analyze the abnormal lipid profile in a child with steatorrhea? First, we look at the triglyceride. If that is normal, low, and the total cholesterol LDL value is very low, then the possibility is usually apital lipoproteinemia and hypobetal lipoproteinemia. A normal lipid profile takes us towards the diagnosis of abital hyperproteinemia because it is an autosomal recessive condition. However, and if the the parents have similarly abnormal lipid profile, then the possibility of hypobetal hyperproteinemia is more, as it is an autosomal dominant disorder. And triglyceride if normal and slightly low cholesterol, LDL, VLDL, then think of the possibility of chylomicron retention disease. So far, worldwide, around 50 cases has been reported, mostly as case reports or small case series. I am presenting here the case series of 4 Turkish children with abital hyperproteinemia. Here we can see that the children who were diagnosed early and started on treatment early, they did not have
Here only. Switch off audio.
any feature of visual or neurological complication even on long-term follow-up of 10 or 11 years. However, those children who were picked up late, they had features of neurological complications like areflexia and retinopathy, and which were refractory to treatment, as we can see in the this case series, thus highlighting the need for early diagnosis and starting treatment in these children. So the take-home message from this case should be that when we encounter a child with steatoria and failure to thrive, then the possibility of pancreatic insufficiency, chronic cholestasis, liver disease, and fat malabsorption should be thought of. Acanthocytes on peripheral blood smear and abnormal lipid profile should prompt us to think about the possibility of abital hyperproteinemia. And the most important part is that the early diagnosis and treatment is essential to prevent the devastating long-term ophthalmological and neurological sequelae. Thank you. Now I'd like to invite Dr. Srinivas to present the next case.
Thank you, Dr. Arya. Good morning, everyone. Today I'll be presenting the next child. He's a 3-year-old male who was born as a preterm, 30-weeker, with a STOMI neonatal course. Following the neonatal period, this child was well thriving till 15 months of age. He then started having significant diarrhea with abdominal distension. The parents also noticed polyuria and polydipsia in this child. And there was multiple episodes of floppiness of all limbs, which required hospital admission, and it improved with potassium supplementation. This following the onset of diarrhea, there was significant weight loss in this child. And this diarrhea was not associated with any perianal excoriation or explosive nature. There was no blood or mucus in stools. There was no edema or blood transfusion history. There was no dietary modification that was done. No history of any constipation. In view of this diarrhea with abdominal distension, a possibility of Hirschsprung's disease related enterocolitis was considered elsewhere, and he underwent a sigmoid colostomy. However, following colostomy, there was no improvement in his symptoms. In SGPGI, on examination, the child was having a significant failure to thrive. There was no anemia, edema, signs of vitamin deficiency, or cutaneous flushing. Blood pressure was within normal limits, and the urine output that was measured was 4.7 ml per kg per hour, which was suggestive of polyuria. So, summarizing the case, this child was having a chronic diarrhea. There was a polyuria with hypokalemia. There was a significant failure to thrive, and he had undergone a sigmoid colostomy, following which there was no improvement in his symptoms. Analyzing the possibilities, there was diarrhea and polyuria, both of which had contributed to the failure to thrive. This diarrhea could be a malabsorptive diarrhea, such as with the causes possible could have been a celiac disease, CMP, or immunodeficiency, or a secretory diarrhea secondary to a neuroblastic tumor, pheochromocytoma, or a carcinoid tumor. The polyuria is likely to be due to renal tubular acidosis or a diabetes, which is secondary to celiac disease or IPEX. This renal tubular acidosis may have been due to an intrinsic renal disease, or it might have been due to a long-standing hypokalemia which had caused a tubulopathy. The diarrhea is more likely to be a secretory diarrhea as there was no evidence of edema, anemia, signs of vitamin deficiency, or lactose intolerance, which would suggest malabsorption, and there was a significant hypokalemia in the history. With this, we investigated the child, and the hemoglobin and albumin of the child were preserved. There was a significant hypokalemia with hypophosphatemia. There were normal blood sugar recordings and normal HbA1c levels. All these were supporting the possibility of a secretory diarrhea, which was confirmed with the fact that there was no response to a nil per oral status for 12 hours in this child. We investigated the child for a renal tubular acidosis. The blood gas analysis revealed a normal anion gap metabolic acidosis, and the simultaneous urine analysis had revealed a pH of 5.5, a mild proteinuria, no hypercalciuria, and the ultrasound of the kidneys were normal. In view of this above findings, we considered the possibility of a proximal renal tubular acidosis. However, at this point of time, now the possibilities that were considered were it is a secretory diarrhea and possibly due to a neuroblastic tumor such as ganglioneuroma, ganglioneuroblastoma, or a neuroblastoma. And in the absence of features such as flushing and hypertension and the age of presentation, causes such as pheochromocytoma and carcinoid tumor become less likely. The polyuria is due to a proximal renal tubular acidosis. However, at this point of time, we cannot say whether it is secondary to an hypokalemia or whether it is an intrinsic renal disease that is causing the renal tubular acidosis. So for further workup, we had done a CT thorax and abdomen in this child, and it revealed a heterogeneously enhancing soft tissue lesion in the right paravertebral region with multiple foci of calcification. This would suggest a neuroblastic tumor like ganglioneuroma, ganglioneuroblastoma, or a neuroblastoma. To differentiate the three, we had done a PET scan, which revealed no metastasis. And to establish the secretory nature of the tumor, 24-hour urine metanephrine, normetanephrine, homovalenic acid, and vanillyl malonylic acid were sent, which were elevated. Also, serum vasoactive intestinal polypeptide levels were sent, the result of which is awaited. So, as the tumor was a single tumor, we had gone forward for an excision of the tumor after by the pediatric surgery team. On table, it revealed that there was a 7 into 6 into 5 centimeter tumor in the right paravertebral location, which was extending from D5 to D12. A complete excision of the tumor without any gross residue was done. The tumor that was excised, the histopathology was suggestive of a ganglioneuroma. Coming to the follow-up of the child, the biochemical profile of the child post-operatively at 1 week and at 6 weeks revealed that the potassium bicarbonate as well as the pH had normalized without any supplementation of potassium or bicarb. The urine output and the stoma output had also become normal. At 6 weeks post-surgery, the child does not have any diarrhea. There is a weight gain of 2 kg and there is no floppiness of limbs that has occurred. The plan is to collect the serum vasoactive intestinal polypeptide levels, repeat the urinary catecholamines which were elevated, and as the rectal biopsy did not show any evidence of Hirschsprung's disease, we have planned to close the sigmoid colostomy. In this child, it is likely that there's a neuroblastic tumor, which is ganglioneuroma, that has secreted a vasoactive intestinal polypeptide, which acts on the receptors in the epithelial cells of the gut, and it increases the gastrointestinal secretions that have led to a secretory diarrhea. This secretory diarrhea also has caused a hypokalemia, and when it is there as long-standing hypokalemia, it causes a tubulopathy, which has resulted in a polyuria. A literature review of ganglioneuroma has revealed that the median age of onset is around 79 months. There is no gender predilection and around 40% to 50% of these tumors are present in the thorax. The urinary catecholamines are elevated in around 22 to 39% of the cases with ganglioneuroma. A review of around 45 children with with vasoactive intestinal polypeptide secreting tumors has revealed that the age of onset is generally around 3.3 years with no gender predilection, and all of them present with diarrhea. Around 85% of them have hypokalemia, 25% have achlorhydria, and 15% have metabolic acidosis. 80% of these tumors are ganglioneuroma or a ganglioneuroblastoma, and they're most commonly located in the adrenal gland, followed by the paravertebral location as seen in our child. With this, I'd like to say that we need to suspect a secretory diarrhea whenever there is large volume watery diarrhea and there is no response to nil per oral status, and when there is a significant electrolyte imbalance. Neuroblastic tumors like ganglioneuroma, ganglioneuroblastoma, and neuroblastoma are the most common causes of tumors leading to secretory diarrhea in children. The treatment depends on the stage of the disease, and tumor resection is curative in localized disease. Our case highlights the need to identify a correct etiology, as it will prevent unnecessary morbidity and surgical procedures like our child has undergone. With this, I'd like to invite Dr. Vignesh to present the next case.
Thank you, Dr. Srinivas. Today, we are going to see about another case. It's a 10-year-old girl who presented to us with history of generalized body swelling for a duration of 10 months. It was not associated with any abdominal pain, respiratory distress, not associated with any jaundice, fever, blood transfusion, no significant illness or surgeries in the past. And around 8 months after the onset of this generalized body swelling, child also developed diarrhea for a duration of 2 months. It was semi-solid to watery in nature, with frequency ranging from 5 to 6 times per day, not associated with any blood or mucus. With these complaints, she presented to us. So on admission, examination showed a preserved growth, and there was no pallor, no jaundice, and there was mild periorbital puffiness and bilateral pitting pidal edema, and there was no lymphadenopathy on general examination. On parabdominal examination, revealed a generalized abdominal distension, which fluid thrill was present. Child underwent an ascitic tap. Post-ascitic tap, there was an ill-defined firm mass with some mobility palpable in mid-abdominal region. This mass was not becoming prominent on leg raising test, nor falling forwards on knee chest position. So likely retroperitoneal mass with intraperitoneal extension was considered. There was no hepatosplenomegaly. So with the features of ascites, peripheral edema and diarrhea, which suggests protein-losing enteropathy. Along with abdominal lump, it suggests secondary lymphangiectasia more than primary lymphangiectasia. So probable differentials were tuberculosis, lymphoma, and lymphatic malformation. So we can see just an overview of lymphatic circulation. Here, lumbar cisterna chyli receives flow from lumbar lymphatics, hepatic lymph, and intestinal lymph, which all flow through right thoracic duct and left thoracic duct into subclavian vein and into venous circulation. If there is any pathology causing obstruction to this outflow channel, which it will present as symptomatic. Like if there is obstruction to intestinal lymphatics, it will present with loss of chyle and diarrhea. And if it's obstruction in liver, can have ascites, chylous ascites. So we further investigated the child. Hemogram was normal, and there was a significant hypoproteinemia and hypoalbuminemia, along with mild decrease in calcium levels. Inflammatory markers are within normal limits, and tuberculosis workup was unyielding. Ascitic tap, on gross examination, we can see milky white fluid is chylous in nature, and the fluid analysis revealed a lymphocytic predominant ascitic fluid with elevated triglycerides. There is no atypical cells. So to confirm the etiology of protein-losing enteropathy, we did an upper GI endoscopy, which revealed a snowflake appearance in the D1 and D2, duodenal region, D1 and D2, which suggests lymphangiectasia. So which was confirmed further with the duodenal biopsy. It shows dilated lymphatics, confirming the diagnosis of intestinal lymphangiectasia. So now to rule out etiological cause of intestinal lymphangiectasia and in view of palpable abdominal lump, we did a CT abdomen, which revealed a ill-defined soft tissue thickening in root of mesentery and porta and retroperitoneal region, encasing superior mesenteric vessels, celiac artery, and common hepatic artery. Whereas portal vein attenuation also was seen. So with this, lymphoma or lymphangioma was the differentials. So FNAC was unyielding. Hence we proceeded with exploratory rhabdotomy, which revealed a solid mass at the base of mesentery and subhepatic region, for which partial resection was done. And the histopathology of the resected specimen showed dilated thin wall cystic channels, and with fibrotic stoma. There was no RBCs inside the lumen as we see here. There is no granuloma or cellular atypia. So the diagnosis was confirmed as lymphangioma. So hence we treated the child further with high protein, medium chain triglyceride based diet, fat soluble vitamins and calcium supplements, and beta blockers were started. So around 2 months after that, we followed up the child, after which there is no further recurrence of anasaka or diarrhea. And around 12 months after this onset of therapy, there is a significant improvement in the protein and albumin levels, which was normalized. So there was no symptom recurrence, child gained height and weight, and repeat imaging further showed no further increasing in the size of lesion. So the final diagnosis was mesenteric and retroperitoneal lymphangiomatosis with secondary intestinal lymphangiectasia. So here we can see a case series of 13 children who presented with pediatric abdominal lymphangiomas. That majority of them were symptomatic. And in that, around 77% presented with palpable abdominal mass, around 23% had diarrhea. Rest of them had pain, abdominal distension, etc. Around 15% of them had unresectable lesions. So lymphangioma is a benign tumor with good prognosis. Only less than 10% of all lymphangiomas occurs in the abdominal region. Complications include hemorrhage, infection, bowel obstruction, and there is a risk of recurrence when partially resected. If there is a multi-site involvement of lympangioma, it is called diffuse lymphangiomatosis. And when the bone is involved, it is called Gorham-Stout disease. So intestinal lymphangiectasia is characterized by dilated lymphatics resulting from impaired lymphatic drainage, leading to loss of chyle, leading to hypoproteinemia and hypoalbuminemia. There are two types, primary and secondary. Primary is a congenital disorder. It is a majority of children present with primary intestinal lymphangiectasia. Here we share our experience of children with primary intestinal lymphangiectasia. Median age of presentation was around 8 years. That majority of them had pedal edema, diarrhea, anasarca, and diagnosis was confirmed with duodenal biopsy in around 86%. Majority of them improved with dietary therapy. So abdominal lympangioma with intestinal lymphangiectasia, though uncommon, but important cause of protein-losing enteropathy. Clinical features and presence of hypoproteinemia, hypoalbuminemia, and hypocalcemia and lymphopenia are suggestive of intestinal lymphangiectasia. Radiological imaging and histopathological examination helped in diagnosing the secondary etiologies, especially like our case. And dietary modification and complete resection of the lesions improves the overall outcome of abdominal lymphangiomas. With this, I would like to call Dr. Jayendra for the last case of the session and conclusion.
Thank you, Dr. Vignesh. The case 4 is a 15-year-old boy presented to us with large volume watery stools in the past 6 months, with a significant weight loss of 8 kgs, fever and abdomen pain for 1 month. No bloody diarrhea or greasy stools, no family history of celiac, IBD, immunodeficiency, no prior history of ATT intake or contact with tuberculosis, no systemic illnesses, blood transfusion, surgery, or chronic drug intake in the past. The child has been started on gluten-free diet from outside and continued for 3 months with no improvement in symptoms, but the compliance for the same was doubtful. At the time of admission, the weight was in lower centiles compared to height, but both were normal. There was significant pallor, but no icterus, pedal edema, or lymphadenopathy. Abdomen examination was normal with normal bowel sounds, and per-rectal examination was also normal. With the history of chronic diarrhea, weight loss, abdomen pain, fever, and anemia, various possibilities come across, but thinking of the common etiologies that can have the similar presentation as our index case, the causes like celiac disease, Crohn's disease, tuberculosis, and IPSID are considered at this point of time. Workup showed microcytic hypochromic anemia with elevated LDH and lower folate and albumin levels. Tissue transglutaminase levels for celiac disease and inflammatory markers were elevated. Immunoglobulin profile showed very high values of IgA and retroviral screening is negative. Upper GA endoscopy showed cobblestoning of the mucosa and scalloping of mucosal folds in the duodenum. Duodenal biopsy showed subtotal villus atrophy with widely spaced crypts and dense lymphoplasmacytic infiltrates. Though raised tissue transglutaminase levels, endoscopy showing cobblestoning and scalloped folds, and biopsy showing subtotal villus atrophy suggested a possibility of celiac. High levels of IgA, widely spaced crypts, and dense infiltration of mucosa with plasma cells suggested the possibility of alternative diagnosis and the need to work up further. CT enterography showed multiple enlarged mesenteric nodes that was non-necrotic with non-enhancing wall thickening of jejunum. Exhaustive workup for tuberculosis was unyielding. So with the small bowel diarrhea, abdomen pain and fever, subtotal villus atrophy and mesenteric nodes, is it celiac disease with secondary lymphoma? But high IgA and widely spaced crypts might suggest another diagnosis, which is possibly IPSID, that is immunoproliferative small intestinal disease. Serum immunofixation with high performance liquid chromatography showed plenty of IgA type of heavy chain monoclonal protein with no corresponding light chains, suggestive of immunoproliferative small intestinal disease. Further staging done by laparotomy and full thickness biopsies from small bowel was done, and excision of enlarged mesenteric nodes was done. CT thorax and bone marrow examination was normal. Jejunal and ileal biopsies showed subtotal villus atrophy with dense lymphoplasmacytic infiltrates till muscularis propria, and biopsy of mesenteric nodes were showing plasmacytoid blast cells suggestive of high-grade lymphoma. The stage of the disease could be stage 1, that is lymphoma involving small intestine and mesenteric nodes according to Salem classification, and according to histological Gallian classification, it is stage C due to the presence of high-grade lymphomatous proliferation. The child was started on iron, folic acid supplements, given RBC transfusion for anemia, and started on oral tetracyclines after the diagnosis of IPSID was made. And the lymphoma was diagnosed by staging laparotomy and excision biopsy. Chemotherapy was planned. Child is presently continuing chemotherapy from an oncology center and he is doing well. On reviewing the literature for IPSID, there are a few case series involving young adults. In one series from our center, IPSID contributes for 2% of chronic diarrhea in adults, but pediatric data are limited to case reports and small case series. To concise, the disease is common in young adults. Diarrhea and weight loss are most common symptom at presentation. Upper small bowel and mesenteric nodes are usually involved. Biopsy shows villus atrophy with lymphoplasmacytic infiltration. Immunohistochemistry can confirm the abundance of plasma cells, positive for IgA and negative for light chains. Immune electrophoresis in a gel impregnated with antibody for IgA is confirmatory. Almost 50% of the cases are malignant at presentation. Studies showed the incidence of IPSID is reducing in the past 2 decades. Coming to treatment and outcome, different studies showed comparable outcome with the different treatment protocol. To concise, stage A is treated with antibiotics. Stage B and C require chemotherapy. 5-year survival is almost 60 to 95% in stage A and 30 to 50% in stage B and C. Even for stage A disease, till the lesions are completely cured, close monitoring is required as there is a possibility of malignant transformation. The learning points are celiac disease, although the most common cause of chronic diarrhea and villus atrophy in our center, think of IPSID when we are dealing with children in diarrhea in an older child with presence of abdomen pain, fever, and enlarged mesenteric lymph nodes. Histology provides the clues to differentiate celiac from other etiologies. Imaging, endoscopic biopsies, immunoglobulin profile, and failure of therapeutic dietary trials might clinch the diagnosis. Finally, to conclude, etiological spectrum of chronic diarrhea varies among different age group and geographical location. A systematic approach based on the age of onset and nature of diarrhea is required. Knowledge of common causes from our area is important to prioritize the workup. Endoscopy, histology, and imaging are most useful investigations for making the diagnosis. Team approach is required involving pediatric gastroenterologist, pathologist, surgeon, radiologist, endocrinologist, hematologist, and dietitian for effective management. Even in the cases we discussed, imaging gave us clue in 3 out of 4 cases. Histopathology clinched the diagnosis in all the patients, and surgical management was necessary in 3 out of 4 cases, emphasizing the importance of team approach. Once a correct diagnosis is made, it is very rewarding to treat, as evident from all our cases. Thank you.